Before the video starts, just a quick reminder to go check out the Chilling app. If you can't get enough content from me here on this channel, myself and other narrators here on YouTube are providing hours of unique and spine-tingling scary story narrations exclusively over on Chilling. There's new narrations from me added weekly, and there's new professional narrators constantly being added to the list. There's literally hundreds of hours of scary stories to binge on, from monsters, paranormal, thrillers, and true scary stories. The Chilling app even has classic novels, true crime stories, and chilling original series. And this all can be enjoyed with their one-of-a-kind ambient menu, where you can mix in immersive and relaxing sound effects like a crackling fire, dark storms, and chill rain, and adjust their volumes independently and a sleep timer so you can drift off to dreamland without interruptions after. And guess what? They just added the ability to download stories you're listening to, so you can listen offline now as well. Click the link in the description or the pinned comment to try the free trial of the Chilling app, and after that it's only $2.99 a month, which makes it completely ad and interruption free. Also, before I forget, April 22nd marks 1 year since we launched Chilling, and they're doing a huge giveaway of a Samsung 70-inch Class 7 Series LED 4K UHD Smart TV, along with a Samsung 4.1 channel soundbar and a limited edition Chilling Year 1 t-shirt. 2 first-place runners-up will receive a $100 gift card to Amazon and a limited edition Chilling Year 1 t-shirt, and 5 second-place runners-up will receive a $25 gift card to Amazon and a limited edition Chilling Year 1 t-shirt. The winner will be announced on May 2nd, and you can find details in the links in the description or pinned comment below. Now on to the stories. I'm from a place called Plymouth in southwest England, and for the longest time now, I've gone on long runs over the weekends to keep up with my fitness. Last June, I decided to go for a long one along the cliffs and through the forests of Bulberry Down and Overbeck's Gardens. I'd never been before, and I've heard it's a really beautiful place, with the sea air really invigorating you as you run. But just as I was getting closer and closer to the 10th kilometer mark, the old brain fog started to descend. I got myself a bit lost and ended up missing the turn I needed to go back on myself so I could get back to my car. The next thing I know, I'm seeing signs for a little town called Sulcombe, but since it was coming up to about 4:30 and it was still bloody roasting out, I thought I'd just head into the village, maybe grab some water, then ask directions back towards a place called Marlborough, so I could run back towards the place I'd parked my car. Anyways, as I'm running down this hill into Sulcombe, I suddenly find myself really needing a wee. Just one of the problems you face when on one of those long runs. The water you drink just comes right out the other end in like half an hour. But luckily, there was this wooded area where I thought I could just hop off the road to drain the main vein behind a tree. So as I said, I took a quick look around to make sure no one was watching, then I ran up this little grass verge and into the woods. I'm still thoroughly lost at this point, having never been anywhere near Sulcombe before, but I thought I'd be relatively easy just to ask for directions and be on my way within the hour. Little did I know, I wouldn't be running back towards Marlborough or my car. I'd be headed back to it in a police car after stumbling across something truly horrifying after taking a whiz. So I take my leak, then as I'm walking back towards the open road, I see something lying in the dirt, wrapped in bin bags. As weird as it sounds, my first thought was that I'd stumbled across the dumping ground of some local serial killer, but it was just a bit of melodrama in my head talking. Just a dark joke that I thought would remain exactly that. Besides, it wasn't shaped like a body. It was more just like a jump covered in a bin liner, more likely to be someone's fly tipping than anything else. But then as I got closer to pass it on my way out of the woods, the smell hit me. I'd never smelled death like that before, but I knew what it was. If you've ever left some chicken in the fridge a bit too long, and there's that gag-inducing ammonia smell, it was just like that. That's what I was hoping it was anyway, as I walked over and nudged the opening of the bin liner wider with my running shoe, just someone's rubbish they decided to dump somewhere after missing bin collection day or something like that. The first thing I saw was like a cut of meat, like perfectly sliced too. But then I saw what was obviously the stump of a person's neck on top of their shoulders. They'd been decapitated. I started to gag, and I ran back onto the road, puked up the water I'd finished off on the way into Sulcombe, then immediately called the police. Given that I was the person who found the body, the police told me to wait where I was so I could answer a few questions, and it was honestly even scarier when I realized they thought it was me that might have dumped it there. It was easy enough to clear myself of suspicion, though, once I told them my story, and when all was said and done and the forensics team had showed up and put tape around the woods, the officer was nice enough to give me a lift back to my car, which was parked all the way back near Hope Cove. I was actually a bit worried that I'd get a fine for public urination or something, but the police weren't in the least bit interested in such a petty crime when they had an actual murder on their hands. They also ended up getting back in touch with me a few days later, asking if I'd seen any suspicious activity in the area on the day of my run. Anyone hanging around near the little bit of woodland, anything leaving in a hurry after I showed up, but obviously, I already told them that the place was empty when I jogged to relieve myself, so I just reiterated that old point, and that was the last I heard from them. I later found out that the victim was this poor old Malaysian lady. I think she was in her 60s when she was killed. I haven't heard about any killer being arrested, so it must have still been an ongoing thing over here. It took me quite a while to get over this whole thing. Like, I still get a bit nervous about being near clusters of woodland, wondering what other poor sods have been found in such sorry states over the years. Just dumped somewhere, wrapped in bin bags like somebody's unwanted rubbish or something. And it's horrible to think about, really. I hope if you read this out on your channel, someone in the UK might be able to look this up and realize that they know something about the victim or her final days. Whoever did those things to her deserves to be in prison for a long, long time, and the fact that they're still just walking the streets is enough to turn my stomach. Back when I was in university, I joined the Walking and Hiking Society, and in stark contrast to the rather boring name, they oversaw some of the most exciting trips abroad the uni had to offer. Every year, they'd organize trips to some of the best hiking spots in the world, and during my second year, the destination happened to be the Carpathian Mountains. For those that don't know, the Carpathians run through several different Central European countries, but the vast majority of them are in Romania. The Carpathians are home to some of the wildest forests in all of Europe and are also home to some rather frightening wildlife. There are brown bears, wolves, lynxes, all things you definitely wouldn't want to bump into while taking that early morning bathroom break. But it wasn't the wildlife that made our Carpathians trip so creepy. It was a group of people we ran into after getting ourselves lost in the Rodna Mountains National Park. So, you're never really lost in the woods. Not if you're a good enough navigator. If you have a map and a compass, some food and some water, you can always just push on until you figure out where you are based on landmarks and whatnot. That's why when the leader of our hiking group, a younger professor we called George, said we might have taken a wrong turn down one of the trails, we weren't panicking or anything like that. In fact, it actually felt quite exciting thinking that we were venturing into the unknown. After all, you never improve your skills unless they're actually tested, and there's never any real growth without true discomfort. We knew we had to cross one particular mountain, and the key to do it was finding this one particular mountain pass, and as you can imagine, that's easy enough to do. All you have to do is find the spot where the mountains dip low enough, and Bob's your uncle. There's your way through. So it was simply a case of finding an elevated position, finding where the range dipped, then just orienting ourselves towards it. Easy peasy lemon squeezy, I thought. Then, off we marched in the direction of the pass. There was just one little problem, and that was the issue of sustenance. Because we all focused on having an ultralight kit, We'd taken minimal food and water with us and planned to stop off at various little villages along the route in order to take on supplies. And given that we'd missed one of our village stops due to getting ourselves a bit lost, we ended up running out of our substantial food supplies. This wasn't a huge problem as we still had a few cereal bars and glucose gel packs to keep us going, and finding fresh water from mountain streams was surprisingly easy. But on the day before we planned to navigate the pass, we were all starting to feel pretty hangry as a result of the shortage. So, at one point we all decided to take a break while George and another member of the group decided to scout the area to see if they could find any sources of food, wild or otherwise. About 2 hours after they departed, they returned with some good news. They'd spotted what looked like a small village up in the mountains, one that wasn't on our maps but was definitely populated since there was smoke coming from various chimneys and whatnot. The plan was to show up, be very polite, and offer them some cash in exchange for whatever food they could give us. We didn't give a monkey's butt if we had to pay over the odds for it. We were that hungry, and we would have paid triple the going rate for a decent hot meal. So, that was all it took to get us on the move again, and with the promise of full stomachs, we found ourselves with renewed energy to walk a few miles up to the mountain village. It was definitely a bit nerve-wracking. I mean, what if they weren't friendly, or just straight up refused to sell us anything despite us offering them a fistful of cash? If we took the gamble and it didn't pay off, we'd have a terrible time crossing the mountain pass. A person can go a long time without food, and we had enough water to last us, but we'd definitely be in a bad way once we got to the next village after the pass. Passing out from hunger is bad enough at the best of times, but pass out and tumble down the mountainside, and that could be the end of you. So, you can imagine how elated and grateful we were when we reached the village, and they were actually quite welcoming to us. I say quite because, as much as the bloke we offered money seemed over the moon to have us trudge into his village, some of the other villagers seemed less than impressed at our presence. I really don't mean this to sound too mean or ungrateful because they literally saved our butts out there, but a lot of them just didn't look right, if that makes sense. I wouldn't have been surprised if there was a bit of inbreeding going on, to put it that way, and some of them had this faraway glassy look in their eyes like there wasn't too much going on between their ears, if you get my drift. So, as much as we were happy to be eating some proper food for the first time in like 24 hours, we were quite keen on getting out of there too. We were offered goat milk and goat meat, a few baked potatoes, pretty basic food like that, and my God did it taste amazing, even with what little seasoning they used. After that, we spent about an hour just relaxing and digesting with full-on food babies until we realized, in a bit of a panic, that sunset was fast approaching. But then, when it came to asking the village head man to help us find the mountain pass, he casually refused, then kept making hand gestures that we interpreted as tomorrow or in the morning. A quick show of hands showed that almost no one was focused on bedding down in the village overnight, and given that some of the other girls complained that some of the village boys had been giving them some rather unsavory looks, they'd rather take their chances camped out in the mountainside than stay in the village overnight. And given how we could literally hear wolves howling on the preceding nights, that was really saying something. So, that's how we ended up packing up our gear, thanking the village head guy after giving him a big chunk of change, and heading off into the twilight to find somewhere to camp. Once we'd walked a fair distance away from the village, we all started setting up our little tents and whatnot, got a few fires going, and after warming ourselves and laughing about the close call we had, we all tried to get some sleep before the busy day ahead of us. We really did need to get all the sleep we could get, as traversing the mountain pass was going to be a heck of a lot of work, even with the food in our bellies. It turns out, no one would get any decent sleep, on account of the visitor we received in the middle of the night. I remember being shaken awake by the girl I was sharing a tent with, who told me in this really shaky, scared voice to put my boots on. The next thing I know, I can hear George, the professor leading our group, calling out to someone. He was saying things like, "Do you speak English? Are you from the village? We're leaving in the morning and we don't want any trouble." Whoever he was talking to wasn't saying anything back, and It was around then that I put my boots on and stuck my head outside of the tent to see if I could get a look at the person. Only it wasn't just one person. It was about 4 or 5 different people, stood on a rise above our campsite, shining flashlights down onto us. At least, I think it was only that many, because that's how many torches that they were shining down on us. There could have been a lot more that we couldn't see. We didn't know who they were or what their intentions were. We had no idea if they were from the village or not, if they intended to rob us and take the rest of our money, or something even worse. Like I said, there were a few of the village boys who seemed to have taken an unhealthy liking to some of the girls in our group, and my own personal worst fear was just that they'd found our camp and were intent on dragging 1 or 2 of us away for you-know-what. Thankfully, a few of the guys came out of their tents to see what was going on. Their torches switched off and we heard the sound of boots on rocks, then silence, meaning whoever it was had retreated. And we all breathed this collective sigh of relief, but like I said, sleep didn't come easy after that, and that's if you were able to get any sleep at all. At first light, we packed up our things and headed off in the direction of the mountain pass. It was seriously tough on next to no sleep, but thankfully the food in our bellies and the fear in our chests motivated us sufficiently to make it all the way to the other side by the early afternoon. We were all elated by the time we made it across and down onto the lush green fields on the other side. It was like a little slice of paradise right before our eyes. And the best thing, we could clearly see quite a large village just a mile or 2 away, one that would certainly have access to food and, more importantly, alcohol. I personally needed a strong one after the day that we'd had, and luckily, there was a small bar in the village square that was only too happy to provide us with these big bottles of plum brandy they called palinka. And the owner of the bar was quite proficient in English too, which certainly made our lives easier, and he ended up asking us about our trip. Obviously, one of the first things we told him about was our run-in at the mountain village. How it had started out as a rather nervy encounter that turned into a seriously creepy midnight confrontation. When we told him, he gave us this rather bemused look, before telling us that we must have been confused. According to him, there were no villages around the mountain pass, and that they'd all been demolished during the communist era, with the occupants being moved onto collective farms. We all sort of gave each other these funny looks as if to say, well, that can't be right, before informing him that he was mistaken. If the government had deported all those mountain people, it looked like they'd moved right back up there as soon as the Iron Curtain fell, so to speak. The conversation then moved on to us asking why the government had done something so cruel as to deport entire villages away from their homes, and shockingly, the bar owners seemed to have very little sympathy for them. He launched off into some speech about it being the best thing for them, how they were all illiterate and they needed to be dragged kicking and screaming into the modern world. We thought this was a bit harsh, honestly. I mean, everyone is entitled to live the way they want to. At least, that's the way I see it. But he disagreed. He said if we knew the truth about what they did up there, we wouldn't be so sympathetic. Then, without a hint of jest or hyperbole to his words, he tells us that they're cannibals, and that they eat the weakest of their own number in order to conserve resources. Not only that, but they steal the breast milk of their pregnant women to distribute among the men of the village. That's when one of us piped up that one of the first things they'd shared with us was meat and milk. Of course, they'd claimed it was goat milk, but none of us had ever drank it before, so how would we know the difference? The man looked absolutely horrified when we told him this, then promptly walked away from our table before disappearing behind the bar. Our group looked equally horrified, at least until a few of the older members spoke up that the bloke was either seriously misinformed, horrifically bigoted, or was just playing some elaborate joke on us that he could share with his regulars for a good old laugh. This one guy named Adrian was saying something like there was absolutely no chance, that they were a bit backwards, but cannibals, no bloody chance. And I'm very much inclined to agree with him on that. We were in Romania, not some random isolated island, And given the grinding poverty they were suffering, it was almost an impossibility that they'd share anything as precious as milk with us, even if they were bloody paying. After all, there were tons of goats trotting around the village, plenty of females with swollen udders too, so I can almost categorically say that we didn't engage in cannibalism, nor did we drink any of the women's milk, so to speak. The only thing that really still scares me to this day is the gang of mysterious people who we encountered, the ones who shone torches down on us from the ridgeline above. No one with any innocent intentions just rolls up on a camp of sleeping people like that. They didn't say a word to us, didn't greet us in Romanian, and you think they'd at least say something to us to ensure their good intentions, even if it was in a language we couldn't understand. After all, it's all in the tone of voice and not so much exactly what you're saying. It makes me wonder what would have happened if there hadn't been so many of us, if it had been just all girls or the lads hadn't come out of their tents for an unintentional show of force. Sometimes I don't think they were just curious about us. Sometimes I think that they had something very, very bad in mind for us, and we're all extremely lucky that they didn't go ahead with whatever they were planning. I don't think it was the nicer guy who fed us either. I don't think it had anything to do with him. I think it was the younger lads who had been ogling the girls in our group, and I think they'd have been monsters given half the chance. All in all, it was a wonderful trip, just one that was slightly marred by a rather unpleasant nocturnal encounter. The people we met in Romania were, for the most part, some of the kindest, most welcoming people one could ever wish to meet. But there were a small few, and I say this in no uncertain terms, that might have done things to us that meant we never made it home, alive. Let me tell you the story of how I became a pescatarian. I had a very privileged upbringing in New England. I'm talking very privileged. The old stereotype is that every little girl wants a pony for her birthday, and my reality was that I actually got a pony for my birthday, my 12th to be exact. He was a Cremello Welsh pony, and it was love at first sight. I named him Custard, and during the summer of 1997, I rode him almost every single day. I mostly rode him around the land my family owned just outside of Norwalk, Connecticut, but most weekends I ride him further afield with my mom, who owned her own house and knew the best riding trails in Fairfield County. It got to become a regular thing, and as I learned more and more about Custard and how to take care of him, the more I became convinced that the rest of my life was going to involve horses and ponies in some shape or form. It became my dream job, something I thought would fulfill me and sustain me until retirement. But one day, someone took that dream away from me in an event that changed my life forever. For the longest time, Mom would always ride ahead on her prized Andalusian, saying that she'd only let me lead once I had proper control of Custard. Or there came a point when I asked for her, like the 1000th time, and she finally looked back at me and nodded with a smile. I was so excited. All I ever wanted was to feel free like that, cantering with Custard through the woods, feeling like we could ride all the way down to Mexico, just like the cowboys in the movies my dad loved. Half the reason I called my pony Custard was because it was what I used to call General Custer when I was only half out of my baby talk years. And although we always rode in the prim and proper hard hats and jodhpurs my mom always wore, in my head, I was always in a plaid shirt and jeans minus the spurs, but always topped off with a well-worn Stetson. I guess I rode a little too far ahead at some point because when I slowed down and brought Custard to a stop, I looked around and didn't see Mom behind me. I know I should have just turned back to meet her, but it felt so good just being alone out there in the woods, just me and Custard alone in the wild frontier. So instead of turning around and cantering back to meet her, I just kept Custard trotting along the trail nice and slow, soaking up how quiet and still everything was on that unseasonably balmy fall afternoon. I guess that should have been my first warning. There was no bird songs, no sounds but those of Custard's hooves padding through the soft dirt below us. Then, just as I was about to call out for my mom, my whole world ended in the space of maybe only half a second. For long stretches of our rides, I'd look down at the back of Custard's neck and at the top of his head, just completely and utterly smitten with him. I loved his ears and the way they'd twitch and tense as he listened to different distant sounds, how his blonde mane glowed golden whenever sunlight hit it. I was doing exactly that just as I was about to call out for Mom, so my eyes were right where they shouldn't have been when his just disintegrated before my eyes. The loud bang in the near distance barely even registered as he fell over to one side and hit the dirt hard, mainly because he'd trapped my left leg under him and the pain that shot through it was like nothing I'd ever felt before. Then, because I was trapped, I was held in place and basically forced to witness what remained of my poor Custard's head. And that was the only mercy, really, knowing he hadn't suffered at all when the bullet that killed him passed through his skull. But my God, the mess it made. Seeing all that raw flesh and brain matter spread across the trail, it literally scared me for my life. The hunters made it over to me before Mom caught up, obviously terrified by the sounds of my screams. We later found out that they'd gotten lost in the woods and had lost track of where their hunting grounds ended and where the horse trails began. I don't know what their problem was, if they were just dumb or in some way malicious, but they claimed they thought Custard was a deer or something, that their hide made it hard to tell, but they just took the shot anyway. Mom made sure that they faced the full force of the law for what they did, had them arrested, sued them for damages, the whole 9 yards. She remained convinced that it was no accident until the day she died, and honestly, I'm inclined to believe her, and I'm glad that they had their various licenses revoked for life. People like that don't deserve Second Amendment rights. Either they're too dumb or too evil to be allowed to own guns. It just sucks that they didn't receive any prison sentences or anything. They took a life. They deserve to be locked up, in my opinion. But the laws in this country basically turn animals into property, and killing one that belongs to a person is basically no different than breaking one of their car windows. I had to go through a lot of therapy just to be able to go outside again following Custard's death, and I still find it extremely triggering to see horses anywhere. Hence why I was never able to follow up on my dream of working with them or ponies. I also found myself extremely adverse to almost all kinds of meat afterwards, as it just reminded me of all of that. I'm okay with almost all kinds of seafood except for tuna steak, as things like shrimp or crab are so far removed from mammalian flesh that I'm actually able to stomach the sight of them. I still think about Custard, far more than I should, considering he died 25 years ago now, and I also think of how those hunters got away with their lost in the woods excuse when I think in reality, they knew exactly where they were. Born on October 10th of 1954, Juliana Kopka was born in the Peruvian capital of Lima to German biologist Hans Wilhelm Kopka and his wife, ornithologist Maria Kopka, who were in the employ of Lima's Natural History Museum. When Juliana was just 14 years old, her parents departed Lima to establish an Amazon jungle research station known as Panguana. According to Juliana herself, she became a jungle child, learning more about survival techniques than mathematical equations. Her schoolhouse was Panguana, and her playground was the jungle itself. Yet despite such an unorthodox education, the Kopkas took their daughter's education very seriously and ensured that she both studied the correct materials and took the proper examinations. So when she was 17, Juliana was scheduled to fly back to Lima in December of 1971 in order to take her school's leavers exam at Lima's German school. She passed with flying colors and became an official graduate of the school on December 23rd of 1971. The following day, Juliana and her mother flew back to Panguana via a Peruvian airline known as Lanza. Due to the holiday season, every other flight was booked, and despite Hans's objections to them using an airline with a poor reputation, Juliana and her mother had very little choice if they wished to be back in Panguana for Christmas. Yet they had no way of knowing what a monumentous decision it was. and how it would lead to catastrophic consequences for young Juliana. In the middle of the flight, Juliana's plane was struck by lightning, and unlike modern aircrafts, the Lanza airplane was both poorly designed and poorly maintained. The lightning strike caused cataclysmic damage to the plane's hull, and as it began to disintegrate in midair, the plane took a nosedive and plummeted to the ground. The craft separated into pieces during the descent, and Juliana's seat was torn from its moorings. Within seconds, she found herself falling 2 miles down into the rainforest below. It seems impossible that anyone could survive such a fall, but incredibly, Juliana somehow endured. Many have credited the fact that she remained strapped to her seat as it absorbed much of the impact, but even so, Juliana suffered a broken collarbone and sustained a severe gash to one of her arms. She was the flight's only surviving passenger, as every single other person aboard perished in the crash. Yet, even though she just survived a 10,000-foot fall, her hellish feat of endurance had only just begun. For the next 9 days, Juliana was forced to limp through the humid, insect-infested forest, surviving on nothing but rainwater and half-rotten fruit that had fallen from the surrounding trees. She was practically eaten alive by blood-sucking insects, and as maggots began to infest her wounded arm, the pain was almost unendurable. Anyone else might have died within just a few days, but thanks to her experiences growing up in a jungle environment, Juliana was able to utilize the skills she'd learned as a child in order to sustain herself, as well as avoiding the many death traps that such terrain presented. After just over a week of dehydration, starvation, and barely any sleep, Juliana finally stumbled across an empty encampment. She rummaged through the camp supplies, giving herself basic first aid, but there was still the matter of ridding her wound of the maggots that had infested it. She found some antiseptic wipes that were soaked in pure alcohol, but they weren't enough to reach the deeper portions of her wound. However, Juliana did find a can full of gasoline, and despite the immense pain it caused, she poured the flammable substance into her open wound in order to rid it of the flesh-eating maggots. The agony just about pushed her over the edge, and as she found a cot to lay down in for her first real rest in just over a week, her life teetered in the balance. Miraculously, with timing that was nothing short of divine providence, the missionary party who had constructed the camp returned within just a few hours of Juliana's arrival, and upon finding her, immediately called in a helicopter airlift so that she could be taken to a hospital. It took weeks for Juliana to recover from her injuries, but once she'd fully recovered, she assisted search parties from the Peruvian government in locating the Lanza plane's crash site. She helped recover almost all the bodies of those lost in the plane crash, but there was only one she truly wanted to find, that of her mother, Maria. Juliana finally found her mother's corpse on January 12th of 1972, and with her father's help, repatriated it back to Germany for a proper burial. It was an incredibly emotional affair for both father and daughter, and naturally, it left an indelible impression on young Juliana. Over the years that followed, she opted to follow in her mother's footsteps. She studied biology at the University of Kiel and went on to receive a doctorate from the University of Munich. Following that, Juliana returned to Peru to conduct research in mammalogy, specializing in bats. Then, following the death of her father in the year 2000, Juliana took over as the director of the Panguana Research Station, carrying on her parents' legacy and overcoming the trauma she suffered as a result of her nightmarish experiences. Juliana's story was documented by world-renowned filmmaker Werner Herzog in a picture he titled Wings of Hope. Herzog was interested in telling Juliana's story not just because of how enthralling it is, but also because of how deeply personal of a connection he had to the tale. You see, Herzog himself was actually scheduled to fly on the very same flight that crashed in the Amazon back in 1971, and it was only a last-minute change of plans that saved his life. Herzog was haunted by that fact, and if he had indeed taken that flight, it would have been his body that Juliana helped recover following her convalescence. Such a detail amounts to another chilling twist to an already horrifying tale of loss and survival, and reminds us that our own end might just be a twist of fate away. On April 5th of 2017, 22-year-old Californian cyclist Jacob Gray set off from Washington State's Port Townsend, intent on cycling through the Olympic National Park. The bike he was riding was a specialized hard rock that some believe was slightly too small for Jacob. It was just an inch below 6 foot. Yet the bike had sentimental value, as it was a promotional model that his father had won at a contractor's show raffle. Attached to the rear of the bike was a used red and yellow child trailer, one that Jacob had loaded with the camping gear before setting off into the wilderness. Jacob was later sighted in Indian Valley and along Crescent Lake on April 5th, while on the morning of April 6th, a woman drove past him as he rode down the Solduck Hot Springs Road. Then, later that afternoon, she noticed his distinctive red and yellow trailer on the side of the road. It wasn't a good place to camp or stash a bike for long, as it was highly visible among the foliage. Jacob was nowhere to be seen, but little did the woman know, Jacob would never be seen again. A few hours later, his abandoned gear was found by park rangers, who noted something odd about the setup. A bow was lying on the ground next to the abandoned bike and trailer, and not only were arrows jammed into the dirt near the bike itself, but arrows seemed to have struck the red and yellow trailer which held Jacob's possessions. The ranger in question, a man named John Bowie, then proceeded to search the immediate area, believing the bike's owners may have stopped at a nearby spring to collect water. But again, Jacob was nowhere to be seen. Bowie then contacted a fellow park ranger and asked him to recheck the area the following morning. He expected the bike's owner to have returned to remove his gear, but the frame and trailer were still there on the morning of April 7th. A park ranger then searched Jacob's abandoned gear and found a list of phone numbers which identified the gear's owner as Jacob. He then contacted one of the people on the list, who turned out to be Jacob's sister, Mallory. Then once Jacob's parents were informed of his abandoned gear, the grave nature of the situation became clear. At that point, Jacob Gray officially became a missing person. The next day, the Clallam County Sheriff's Department combed over the area using around 30 different deputies and sniffer dogs to try to track down the missing cyclist. Yet even with all the manpower, they failed to locate him. A few days later, the Sheriff's Department enlisted the help of volunteer trackers from the Olympic Mountain Rescue. This team of dedicated specialists were much more adept at tracking the movements of missing people, and as they searched, they made a series of curious discoveries. They found compelling evidence that someone, most likely Jacob, had swapped a pair of hiking boots for running shoes before walking to the edge of a nearby river. There, they appeared to have slipped and fallen, leaving a distinct mark on a mossy rock. Yet about 30 yards downstream, there were signs that this person had managed to pull themselves out of the river, eliminating the prospect that Jacob had drowned before being carried downriver. They doubled down on this theory by having team members search the log jams further down the river, but no trace of any body was found, and the search continued. Yet despite the ongoing efforts, on April 14th, the status of the search for Jacob Gray was changed to that of limited continuous search. This meant that rangers were no longer looking for a living person, as it was believed to be impossible for Jacob to have survived almost 2 weeks without protection from the elements. Search and rescue teams moved on to other tasks, leaving the search for Jacob to be headed up by volunteers only. This was extremely demoralizing for Jacob's family, but they refused to give up, and over the coming months, they personally organized at least a dozen searches of the Olympic National Park. Flyers were posted on park kiosks and gas stations in the Port Angeles area, and a team consisting of Jacob's friends and relatives handed out leaflets to people hiking through the park. This culminated in a huge 100-man search along the Solduck River in July of 2017, but only a pair of Burnside brand shorts in Jacob's size were recovered, a pair that matched an item he'd been given as a Christmas gift that previous year. This briefly renewed the family's hope of finding Jacob alive, but over the year that followed, the lack of any additional findings meant that the searches had to be scaled back, and a grim acceptance set in that they'd never see their beloved Jacob alive again. More than a year later, on Friday, August 10th of 2018, a team of biologists ventured into the Olympic National Park in order to study marmots. They found themselves atop a ridge above Whole Lake, and it was there that they made a horrifying discovery. Along with his clothing, some of his gear, and his wallet, the team of scientists found what remained of Jacob Gray's lifeless body. This spot was more than 15 miles from where Jacob abandoned his bicycle, so what exactly prompted the young man to abandon his things before climbing up so far into the mountains? Despite the discovery of a bow and arrows near his abandoned bicycle, and after identifying Jacob via his dental records, a coroner argued that there was very little evidence of foul play. He had a cigarette lighter, insulated clothing, and plenty of food with him at the scene where the body was found. Yet it was soon determined that the only rational explanation was that Jacob had somehow succumbed to hypothermia, as during the April he went missing, the terrain had been covered in a thick blanket of snow. However, this completely ignores the fact that Jacob's remains were little more than skeletal by the time they were found. There could have been any number of fatal wounds to Jacob's biodegradable tissues that would have been impossible to identify. It's also worth noting that when lost in the wilderness, most people know well enough to head down hillsides instead of climbing them. The last thing you want to do is end up stranded on a mountain when you could hike down to more temperate climates. But a person being pursued by someone or something might well climb up a mountainside in order to escape something chasing them, especially if that thing had previously fired at them with a bow and arrow. There's something else worth noting too, and that involves the items found in the vicinity of Jacob's skeletal remains. He was carrying a Bible with him. It seems when he abandoned his bicycle, he grabbed only what was completely essential for his survival: the lighter, the food, and the warm clothing. What would possess him to bring the Bible along? It's possible that he wished to use the pages as kindling, yet despite how badly degraded they were by the elements, the Bible's pages showed no signs of being ripped or torn. Just what was it about a Bible that Jacob saw as being essential to his survival? What was chasing him that he believed a holy text might be a salvation? There have been many that argued that Jacob's intention was to take his own life, and that carrying the Bible with him was an attempt to counterbalance the mortal sin that he perceived himself to be doing. But this raises the question: if Jacob intended on taking his own life, why bother bringing so much survival gear on a trip that would ultimately end in his death? It's entirely likely that Jacob wanted one last biking trip before going through with the act. But that theory completely ignores the fact that a bow and arrow were found at the site of his abandoned vehicle. It's not out of the question that Jacob brought these items along with him and intended to use them as some part of survivalist-style exercise. Yet if that was the case, why were arrows shot into the ground at an angle which would suggest they were being fired at Jacob? And if he was being attacked, he could have at least tried using the bow to defend himself. Only he didn't, which leads us to believe that an attacker was wielding the bow. But what kind of psychopath stalks from the forests of Washington hunting for human game? Who could have terrified Jacob so much that he'd have preferred to risk the freezing mountainside than risk walking back down into the woods? Did Jacob really get lost in the woods, as some people contend, or rather, was he stalked, attacked, and then chased up the mountain by someone who still walks among us today? On the night of November 14th, 2015, two Welsh brothers named Andrew and Mark Middle were out camping in the Clocainog forest in northern Wales. They were there to watch the 2015 Wales Rally, an annual off-road car racing event which both brothers were extremely enthusiastic about. So enthusiastic that they would opt to camp out in almost sub-zero temperatures in order to maintain the perfect vantage point to watch the powerful vehicles hurtle past them. Given how cold it was, the brothers would naturally need to maintain a campfire in order to keep warm, and as anyone who's had to keep a campfire going overnight, it requires a lot of firewood. The brothers had collected an ample stack of dry kindling that afternoon, but as the night set in and a brisk November chill set in, they found their supplies of firewood dwindling. Apparently, it was Mark's turn to go out and collect some, so he grabbed his flashlight, threw on his woolly gloves and hat, then set off into the pitch-black forest to gather firewood. It's more than likely that, given the time of year, the forest floor was very cold and damp during the night, and we can quite safely assume that Mark Middle's search for sufficiently dry kindling took him much further from his campsite than he would have liked. Then, before he knew it, all of the trees started to look the same, and among the dense, verdant foliage, he realized he'd lost sight of the warm glow of his campfire. Realizing he'd gotten himself lost, Mark called out to his brother, who immediately responded. Then all Mark had to do was follow the sound of his brother's voice, and he'd soon be back at camp. Yet the Clocaenog forest is so dense and wild in places that a few blind footsteps might send him crashing into the dirt below. So to ensure this didn't happen, Mark shone his flashlight on the ground beneath him to make sure that he was clear of trip hazards. Back at camp, Andrew Middle was only mildly concerned about his brother calling out to him. Although it was very dark, Mark hadn't walked far, and he would most definitely be able to find his way back to camp from the sound of his voice. What followed was a variation on the famous pool game Marco Polo. Mark would call out to Andrew, and Andrew would call back, until suddenly, Mark went quiet. Then, through the pitch darkness, Andrew Middle quite clearly heard his brother, in a voice that sounded both astounded and horrified, say, "Oh my God." Andrew recognized the fear in Mark's voice immediately and asked his brother what the problem was. Mark stayed quiet for a second, staring in disbelief at the object at his feet, then called out to his brother, "I think you better come and see this." Andrew grabbed his own flashlight and rushed out to find his brother white as a sheet and staring at the ground. Andrew then looked down to see what he was looking at, then muttered his own exclamation of, "Jesus Christ." Half buried in the earth, caked in moss and filth, was a human skull. Mark and Andrew quickly made their way back to their campsite and immediately contacted police. Emergency services received the call at approximately 8:35 p.m., and by 9 that night, a local police officer had arrived at the scene to confirm the discovery. The officer was quickly followed by a forensics team who sequestered the area off before searching for additional human remains. Hidden just beneath the earth, the team discovered a complete human skeleton that they believed had been deposited there between the years of 1995 and 2005. It was only then that the Middle brothers were informed of something truly horrifying, that the ground they'd been camping on had been once used by notorious serial killer Peter Moore as a dumping ground for men he had murdered. They hadn't just pitched their tent on any old patch of forest. They'd made a camp on a veritable graveyard. What followed was a 5-week-long investigation that involved combing missing persons databases, pathological examinations, and intensive DNA profiling. It was determined that the man died from blunt trauma to the head, and that he had been murdered in an unknown location between 2004 and 2010. The victim was said to have been a well-built man in his 60s at the time of his death, standing between 5'8" and 5'10". Some items of clothing were found near the body consisting of a dark green Pringle jumper and some dark red decomposed Marks and Spencer underwear, but it could not be confirmed that they were associated with the victim. Numerous attempts to identify the man via his DNA and teeth were unsuccessful, and in March of 2017, police confirmed that they had approached Peter Moore with questions regarding the man's identity. Moore claimed that the body did indeed belong to one of his victims, a 46-year-old mature student at Aberystwyth University who had disappeared in 1996. Moore refused to reveal the victim's name, but journalists identified a Roger Evans of Bradley near Stoke-on-Trent as a mature student who had indeed gone missing in 1996. However, police later announced that this theory had been discounted due to conflicting dates, and to this day, the identities of both the victim and his murderer remain a complete mystery. However, the prevailing theory is that Peter Moore is indeed the man's killer, and simply fed the police a string of false information in order to throw them off the scent. Moore was famous for claiming that his murders had actually been committed by a fictitious homosexual lover he nicknamed Jason, after the killer in the Friday the 13th movie series. He might have found a great deal of satisfaction in finally having deceived those that sent him to prison on a whole life order. The identity of Moore's apparently murderous lover was never uncovered, and despite jurors having decided that his claims were complete fiction, he might have found a great deal of satisfaction in finally having deceived those that sent him to prison on a whole life sentence. The identity of Moore's apparently murderous lover was never uncovered, and despite jurors having decided that his claims were a complete fiction, they might have been very, very wrong. Moore was not only aware of someone who had gone missing in the year following his string of killings, but the victim was found mere yards away from where Moore's other victims had been found. There's a very good chance that Moore was indeed involved in the murder in some capacity, but if he didn't personally murder the victim, who did? Is it possible that Moore wasn't lying when he spoke of this Jason character? Is it possible that he had been part of some kind of kill team back in 1995 when he committed his crimes? Or did the body simply belong to Moore's uncredited fifth victim, one his record will forever remain untainted by this fifth body thanks to a well-thought-out deception? As frustrating as it may be, these are questions that might never be answered, and with Moore rapidly approaching his 76th birthday, the time to get concrete answers is quickly running out. So, next time you're camping and you're out collecting firewood, be careful where you tread. Instead of finding something to warm your bones, you might find something that will make your blood run cold. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, your entire life is pre-recorded.